Hi, and good afternoon. I hope everyone is having a good week, good day, and is ready to go. Got a little technical glitch here, just 1 second. There we go. Today we'll be covering, this is exciting. This is an exciting day. We'll be beginning the book of Acts. Some refer to it as Luke Acts because of the writer, or many people believe the writer to be Luke, someone who followed Paul around Palestine and the region in which they lived during that time. We'll get a little bit more detail about that, but this is actually a very exciting story about how the early church really got going. If you were following along last time when we did James, we focused on mainly the church in Jerusalem because that's who James was mainly over. Acts has a lot to do with the church of Jerusalem, but eventually, as we go through it, you'll notice that we start going and expanding out into the land of the Gentiles. And so it's very, very interesting to see how these two books work together. Of course, James makes a cameo in Acts, and it's just it's very interesting. I guess if you had to summarize the book of Acts down, it was pretty much how is God going to spread the message of Jesus throughout the known world at the time. And we know through Paul that he most likely could have ended up in Spain, so in Europe, and as far as India, going to the east, and possibly even further for some of the other disciples, or at least missionaries during that time. So it's a very expansive book about how the early church really exploded and a lot of the issues that they faced. So some of what we'll be going through today is some of the historical context in which the early church started and why it was so important that the book of Acts be written, and why it was so important that Luke did the work that he was supposed to do for Acts to be read by those in the world during that time and to be able to reflect upon it, but also ever since then. I mean, Acts has been something that has been, of course, part of the early church. Even if you start looking at the 200s and the 400s, there's some debate about Acts during that time. We'll touch very briefly on that, what that looked like, about what it was and why it was so important of a book. We'll talk about Marcion and the effects that he had on the early church, and why Acts was so important to kind of counter what he would say what he would say about Jesus, or what he even would say about Paul. So we'll look at that. So we're looking at pretty much the early church expanding from Jerusalem to Rome, and Paul's journey as we know through that, but we also, of course, see what Peter and James and Barnabas and several others are up to during this time as well. One thing to think about as we look at Acts, and actually you look anywhere in the Bible, especially when you look at the New Testament, there's a lot of hyperlinks back and forth between what we read in the Old Testament and what is seen in the New Testament. And that's important, and that comes in Luke. Luke does that. James, we know, did that. Paul does that. Jesus in the Gospels, when you read Matthew, Mark, or Luke, or John even, you see a lot of hyperlinks back and forth. And so keep that in mind as we go through this book today. Like I said, Luke and Acts are tied very closely together. If you were to look at the end of Luke at, say, chapter 24, verses 44 through 53, and then jump into Acts 1 through 11, you'll see that there's some similarities there. And you'd see that there's almost... there's a reference to Theophilus, who we'll talk about here in a little bit, and see how that's all tied closely together. And it almost seems like the plan of when the canon was developed is that Luke and Acts originally possibly being together. Maybe that wasn't Luke's intention, but it was that way, and had put John in between to kind of break it up, as that almost like a small break in the story from what Luke was telling in kind of a biography of Jesus and Luke to kind of what the spread of the church would be looking like as it goes forward. So we have this epic journey that we see from Nazareth to Rome, starting in Luke, of course, the Gospel of Luke, where we're in Nazareth, Jesus being from Nazareth, and to Rome, which is what we see as we go into Acts. And so it is the story of, you can think of this as the story of salvation, the story of the Savior the story of those who were saved, and for the most part, traces how salvation extended from Israel to the ends of the earth, or probably better said, from Jerusalem or Judea to the ends of the earth. So it's salvation from faith and repentance, but happening in many ways. And so what we see in the book of Acts, we also see it in Luke, but we're of course focusing on Acts here. We see how God works through disaster, how God works through healing, how God works through the removal of shame, how God works through removal of status, how we see ourselves in society, and much, much more. A little bit of a historical background, or actually, historical background, not historical context to the time period, but a little bit historical background on the book itself. The name that we refer to now, the Acts of the Apostles, was given to the book of Acts probably in the 2nd century. It was originally circulated, like I said, with the Gospel of Luke, and they were kind of together as one independent history when they were put together. But later in the 2nd century, the canonical Gospels, Matthew, and Mark, and Luke, of course, is one of those as well, and John, were starting to circulate as well. And so people were starting to see how the stories of the Gospels were similar, but Acts was a little bit different. And so you got a little bit of a different, you got some different labeling of these books during that time period. The earliest version of that we have access to of Acts is probably anywhere dated between 175 and 225 AD. But while the Gospels were starting to kind of get their own momentum, so Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were starting to get their own momentum, Acts was kind of left out on its own and separated from the Gospels. And about this time, while these were being compiled and put together, Paul's letters, which were referred to as, at one point were referred to as the apostle. That's what the grouping of his letters would be referred to in the early church. We had that. So in the early church, so you're looking at probably 2nd to 3rd century, you had the Gospels, or the Gospel. They didn't call them the Gospels because it was one Gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You had the apostle, which is Paul's letters, and then you had Acts, which was kind of a nice historical overview of what the church was doing early on, and kind of the history of the origin of the Christian church. And it was known to tie the collection. So one way we could look at it is that Acts was used to tie the collections. At least it seems like this is maybe what they were thinking when they put this all together, is that you had the Gospels, and then you had the Gospel, and then you had the Apostle, and you had Acts in between to kind of tie those two large collections together. The reason that there's one reason this book is written, there's actually many reasons, but one reason that I found, and I'm going to dig into a few others here in a little bit, but one reason that this book was used was to support the claims of Paul. So Paul, who we know is a major character or within the book of Acts, he is Luke followed, it is our understanding that Luke followed Paul around on his journeys and his trips, and we see different varieties of his writing about how that played out, but is to help people be able to see and be able to understand and identify the claims of Paul. It's considered to be maybe even independent evidence, if we can look at it that way. It provides some context to those reading along to better understand the apostles. So if you read Acts before you start reading Paul's letters, Acts will help provide some context to those letters to kind of better understand his travels, because Paul makes a lot of references in his letters to things that we would not know about unless we read Acts, about some of his travels and the people he met and the adventures that he were on along the way. And so we have to always remember that the letters from Paul, also known as the epistles, were one-way letters. We never saw the response of the letters back. So they're one-way letters with a lot of stuff in there that doesn't have a lot of context or meaning to us unless we were to look at something like Acts. And so that's why the Acts of the Apostle, or the Acts of the Apostles, is so is so good to have for us. So we're going to get a little bit into the whole Marcionite idea here in a little bit, but that was probably another reason that Acts was written at the time, and what was written and why it was done. A little sidebar for those who like trivia. The title of the Acts of the Apostles is a little odd because only Peter was an apostle that was written about, or was a main character in the book. Paul was a self-proclaimed apostle, but Peter was actually a named apostle. But almost nothing is said about most of the other apostles after Matthias that we know about early on in the book, and who is, of course, brought on to replace Judas. So it's one of those things where I think people who have way too much time on their hands start having questions like, why would you call it the Acts of the Apostles when there's actually one real named apostle and one self-proclaimed apostle in it? And anyways, just something that's kind of interesting to see and to think about, kind of makes you think about things like this. The historical context of Acts is very interesting. After you can refer to him as, or however you want, the adventures, the exploits of Alexander the Great, the region of Palestine and the surrounding area began to transition into more of a Hellenistic culture. So he was Greek, and he was bringing in that culture as he was starting to divide and conquer, for the most part, the known world at the time. And eventually, over this time, the Romans started gaining power, and their laws started to come and take effect. So you had two different things going on here. You had the idea of the kind of the culture of the Greeks and the law of the Romans, which all kind of come into Jerusalem and into Palestine in that area. And as you can imagine, for our Jewish friends, that probably led to some issues. And we see some of those conflicts and issues that they face as they live there over centuries with the Hellenistic influence and the and the Roman law. If you're interested in a little bit about Alexander the Great, I would absolutely recommend our Daniel podcast. Not podcast, this isn't a podcast. Our Daniel study that we did on this, because we talked about Daniel, and in Daniel we talked about Alexander the Great being one of the great armies that went through Daniel, and has some historical reference to Daniel, and we did some historical overview of that. So if you're ever curious about that, want to dig into those, I'd recommend maybe checking out one of those studies that we've done in the past over Daniel. One thing we do know about Romans is that they were strict with their laws. They liked unity within the nations that they were conquering. And so what was good about that is with this unity allowed structure, and with structure they created roads and aqueducts and easy ways to get around the region during the time, and Rome was really good at that. And what this allowed for was it allowed this new early church to be able to easily spread the word, because the roads were for the most part very safe. They were safe because the Romans didn't want people killing other people, well, unless they were killing them, and they didn't want to have all the street toughs and the gangs and the horse thieves, or however you want to call them, out there on the roads. And so they kept the roads very safe, and so it was easy to go from one town to the next for the most part, just to kind of spread the word. And a lot of times we think that was mainly just Paul and maybe a few other missionaries and pastors or bishops during that time. But what the evidence has showed is that a lot of the people who spread the influence and the word of Christianity were your everyday merchants, slaves, tradespeople, fishermen, that sort of thing. So they were the ones who were really getting the word out there. Of course, Paul and others played a significant role, as we know, but that's not how the majority of the word got out there. One thing we also know is that the political unity was not great for the early church. So you had the unity as in they could spread the word, as in the roads were safe and it was easy to travel around. But the other side of that was unity required you to follow certain patterns, required you to worship certain things. And for the Romans, they were really into syncretism. So they like to grab multiple beliefs, multiple systems that they think worked, religions, and allow to develop into something that they wanted to happen. And one of those was emperor worship. So the Romans were really big into into emperor worship, and we've seen this time and time again. The people of Judea, the Jerusalem people, dealt with this already with one person that I think would easily come to mind is Nebuchadnezzar in the story of Daniel and what that looked like for the people who were in exile in the story of Daniel. So again, we have some good references back to that in our studies of Daniel about how this wasn't the first time the Jewish people were asked to worship an emperor. At first that was okay, and the reason that was okay is because the Romans had started to understand that the Jewish people kind of had their own god. They were monotheist. Some people would actually refer to them as atheists because they only had one god, which doesn't make a lot of sense. But anyways, the Romans were okay with the Jewish people and their religion for a time because the Jewish priests and leaders were really good at keeping their people under control, and that's really what Rome wanted at the end of the day. Now, what was happening, though, is that you have this new religious sect coming out and, eventually referred to as Christians, coming out of Jerusalem. And they're not as, we'll just say, compliant as the Jewish people were. And they certainly were not going to worship the emperor, and they certainly weren't going to follow a lot of the customs that the Jewish people had started to follow in order to kind of stay in line. And if you go back and read the Gospels, you'll see some kind of the colluding between the Jewish priests and the Roman officials, and that's just the way it worked back then because not anyone, but there is always the tendency to want power and to keep that power. And fortunately, we are so lucky, and this is going to be probably one of many times I use this reference, nobody does that anymore, right? So you don't have to worry about people wanting to get power and keep it and do whatever they can to not have anyone else have power. And so anyways, that's what the Romans and the Jewish people were doing back then without going too far off. Okay, so the syncretism idea. So with these roads, so the benefits of the roads was great. Like I said, it could spread the word. But what that also meant is that people would also interact, and there's intermingling of religions and faiths and everything you could possibly think of. And as we know from the Old Testament, because that's what these people would know, is that they were pagans, and they did pagan worship, and they worshipped all kinds of things that the Jewish people really weren't cool about worshiping. At least they said they weren't cool about worshiping, even though some of them did. They had all these influences coming in, and it was causing kind of this new, of course, like I said, synchronistic way of having a faith or a religion. And this was one way that the Romans were able to keep the peace because it kind of kept everyone kind of going in the same direction. Eventually, it was realized, just like with Daniel and his friends, that they wouldn't eat the meat of the emperor or the food of the emperor. The Romans started to see that this new Jewish sect would not intermingle with these other people, these other religions. And so that's when things started going downhill for the early Christian church. And so for the most part, it was determined that for the good of society, that this group needed to be removed from society. And so a lot of bad things started happening to the early church from the Roman perspective, and also a lot of bad things were happening to the early church from the Jewish perspective, or Jewish priests, the Jewish leaders who kind of wanted to keep their power as well. It goes on even further that it wasn't only just syncretism, it was also their lack of desire to worship the emperor. And again, the reason they would want that is that's the sign of unity, and then ultimately the sign of loyalty, which is what the Romans sought out in order to feel like they were in control, and that there wasn't a bunch of rebellions going on that they were going to have to quash at some point along the way. Romans thought of Jews for the most part as like I said earlier, kind of an antisocial atheist, and again, because of this, and they thought they were pretty quiet and they kind of got along with each other because there's this general understanding. They were not. Their religion was allowed. They were allowed to do their typical practices of worship and going to the temple and sacrifices and everything related to that. It seems at one point, based on Luke's writing, that he was trying to get the new religious sect, this new group of Messianic Jews, this new group of believers, to believe or to have the same level of stature within society as the Jewish people. Anyways, that never happened because you have someone like Herod Agrippa decided to did not. For the most part, he decided that he did not like having this new sect reign around because they were just a little too just a little too off the record. They were just a little too not worth following the rules, and they were really starting to test the loyalty and the unity of the community. So just very quickly, what happened was that he decided to take out James, the brother of John, killed him, and then he arrested Peter, who fortunately was able to escape. So it started, like I said, it was not going well for the early Christian church. Around 62 A.D., many of the leaders of the early Christian community determined it was not safe to be in Jerusalem anymore. It got to the point of where this just isn't going to go good for any of us. We need to get out of here. So they moved to a place called Pella, which is a city not the one in Iowa, or that makes windows, but the one on the other side of the Jordan River. And it was mainly, which was interesting, it was mainly a Gentile population. So these new Jewish Christians, leaders of Jewish Christians, moved to Pella, a kind of more of a Gentile city on the other side of the river. And they moved there not only because of the Romans who were persecuting against them, but also because of the Jewish leaders that were persecuting against them. So a lot of reasons for them to head out of town and to try to figure out where they're going to set up their next headquarters. Early in the Jerusalem church, there were no Hellenistic Christians, or what we'd refer to as Gentiles. They were Jewish Christians. So they were people who were Jews who had decided that the Messiah had fulfilled the promise of what they knew from the Torah, or what they knew from what we refer to as the Old Testament, and that it had happened. It had been fulfilled, and this is the continuation of their faith. So that's that group. So. But there were two groups of Jewish believers that remained. They were those who were the Hebrews, who wanted to keep the customs and the language of their ancestors, but yet understand that there is a Messiah king, and that has all happened. And there are also the Hellenists, and these are not the Hellenist Christians. Those were Gentiles. These are Hellenist Jews who were more influenced by Greek influence, so they were not well looked upon by those who remained the Hebrews, who thought that in order for you to be a Christian, that you had to still follow the customs, the Jewish customs and traditions. And as we know, as we go through Acts, and as we go into if we read Romans, and as you read other letters from Paul, we'll see multiple times where that is an issue, and these people are kind of fighting each other. So you're like, who are these Hellenists, and where do they come from? And that's something that would be of interest to most people, I know. These were people who most likely, they were not living in Jerusalem. They were people who had gone out, maybe part of the diaspora, and decided never to come back, or were so far away and kind of already set their new life that they didn't want to come back. But these were immigrants who had left and had now returned, and they were probably coming from as far away as somewhere in Europe, Asia Minor, Egypt. And they had brought in, of course, a lot of new influences because they had lived in different parts of the world, a different worldview, mind you. And so that's actually something that's really good, and something we all need to keep in mind, because there's always going to be people with different worldviews who yet are still believers in Jesus. These people, the Hellenists, had their own version is actually their Greek version of the Old Testament, referred to as the Septuagint. If you have not read it, I highly recommend it. It's fascinating work. A little bit more information about this. So you had the Hellenistic Jewish Christians were believed to be the bridge to the Gentile churches. That we read about in that Paul. So Corinth, Thessalonica, Ephesus, those groups, those churches, they were part of that. Samaria. So many people believe that the two first, I guess, famous Hellenistic Jewish Christians, at least ones that we're aware of, is Stephen and Philip. And of course, we'll read about both Stephen and Philip, so I'm not going to give away the story at this point, but we do know that Philip started a church in Samaria, and he was outside of the confines of Judea, and most likely this was the first time when Philip and went to Samaria. This was probably the first evidence that the Jewish church, the Jewish Christian church, or maybe you could say the Christian church from Jerusalem. There's many ways to say it. Anyways, this is probably the first time to see that the church was willing to accept Gentiles into the church. We also see that with the Ethiopian eunuch, that story there. That we're not going to give away all that right now, but that is another piece of evidence for that. If we go a little bit further back into Acts, you'll notice that Stephen and Philip were probably some of the first couple deacons for the Jerusalem church, so very well regarded within the church. And of course, there's a lot of history with those guys as well. In Acts, we'll see eventually here in Acts, the Hellenistic Christians and the Jewish Christians butted heads regularly. And there's a lot of strife and angst in the church in Jerusalem, but other parts of the region as well, because this kind of spread out, this angst and the strife kind of spread out further. Again, this is why we get the stories or the letters from Paul, and why we get all this other additional, we see James, and James refers to it, and Peter refers to it, and it's all sort of this tension that's happening around at this point. There's this another issue that the early church faced were these roaming groups of what we'd refer to as true Jews, and they would seize and imprison those suspected of following Jesus of Nazareth. So they would refer to as the Nazarenes. We know someone who's very popular who did that, and that was Saul of Tarsus. He was one of those roaming groups, and he was trying to enforce the Jewish faith from these heretics who have gone out and had started to say the Messiah had come, and there's no way that is possible according to the Jewish leaders during that time. And so you had people like Saul. We will eventually know him as Paul, going out and about and persecuting this new Christian group. Now, they're not called Christians until Antioch, and there's a little bit of a story to that. And that was mainly a reference to the Gentiles, the Gentile Christians, and not the Jewish Christians. So let me just make that clear before we get too far along here about how the whole Christian word came around, and we'll get there a little bit further. But anyways, these new Christian Jews, I think I could refer to them as Messianic Jews, and we'd probably be talking about the same things, or comfortably talking about the same things. They were eventually expelled from the synagogue. So earlier on, these new Christian Jews, they worshipped in the synagogue, and they did a lot of the similar things, even though maybe they even have Hellenistic influences. They still did a lot of Jewish things, but eventually the true Jews expelled them from the synagogues as they were considered to be false Jews. They themselves were heretics according to the Jews, and so they began to gather in private homes, which we know of from stories, of course, from what we see from Paul, and to support each other and break bread together, and we see that in Acts as well. So what we'll see, and kind of a quick pause here, is we'll see in Acts that there are many factions going against the new church, that eventually the new church eventually leaves Jerusalem and actually sets up headquarters in Antioch, and that's where a lot of the early work of the church comes out of Antioch instead of Jerusalem because of all the strife. So you had the Romans who didn't want them there. You had the Jews who didn't want them there. You had the Jewish Christians who didn't want them there, but they also weren't really wanted there either. So you had all these groups, and they all had some sort of issue with these Hellenistic Christians. So just a little bit more details, because I know you guys just love the history of all this and where everyone went, and I find it to be fascinating as well. Over a period of time, probably not that, to be honest, only over a couple decades, most of the Christian Jews had left Jerusalem. They just could not handle it anymore. And so they went to Samaria, Damascus, Antioch, many other far-reaching places. And like I said, Antioch was the first place where the followers of Jesus were referred to as Christians. And this was actually a derogatory term. It was not something that you'd want to be called early on. But eventually what happened was that these guys were like, oh, hey, let's just adopt that and call ourselves that, almost like kind of a poke in the eye to those who are making fun of us. We'll just say, okay, that's what we'll call, and that's what we'll be. And that's how it kind of all went down. And so it was probably about when Paul and Barnabas, which was probably around 44 AD, started working together, is when Antioch became kind of the center of this new Christian faith. Jumping way, way far ahead, so by 135 AD, so we know that a lot of stuff was going on probably in the 30, 40 ADs. There's even all the way up through the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. There's a lot of history that's going on there, and a lot of movement of people groups and people depending on what their beliefs were of where they were going. But by 135 AD, many of the Jewish Christians who had went to Pella are starting to return to Jerusalem, but their relationship with the rest of Christianity, for the most part, had been severed. And now most of the leaders of this new Christian church were Gentile. The Jewish Christian leaders had lost their power, had lost their influence. And so mainly at this point, by 135 AD, they are mainly Gentile leaders. Some would say that the idea of the Jewish Christians fully disappeared probably around 500 AD. They're known as, someone referred to them as the Ebionites, and that is well beyond the scope of anything we're talking about today with Acts. But you'll see that the majority of the book of Acts is about Paul and his relationship with the Gentiles, and so that's why that's significant. The Jews fall away early on in Acts because we see here that it is fulfilled what Jesus had wanted them to do based on the end of the Gospels, to reach the ends of the earth, and that's what we see here. And then we have this great option of evangelism in Acts. Acts is full of evangelism, of course, and it's great. And the Gentile Christians, and what's really interesting about it is that this form of evangelism is where the Gentile Christians, so the Gentiles, continue to reach out to the Jews. These are the true Jews, and telling them that they were now in the Messianic age and that they should open their eyes and their hearts to that. And this led to, as you can imagine, many arguments that continue to this day between Christians and Jews, and regarding the faith of Christianity as the fulfillment of the faith of Judaism. And there's just, that's just a bone of contention that continues to happen to this day, and is something that the early Christians, the early Gentile Christians, worked on long ago, long before any of us were ever here, early on in the early centuries of the church. So when I bring that up, one thing I want us to keep in mind as we go through this is that the early Christians did not think, especially the early Jewish Christians, did not think they had started a new religion. They had been Jews, and in their opinion, they still were. This includes, like I said, the 12 apostles, the 7 deacons that we read about in Acts, Paul. Their faith was not a denial of Judaism, but a conviction that the Messianic age had arrived. And so that's significant, because I think sometimes we think that Christianity is its own sort of religion, but actually it is the fulfillment of Judaism. It's a fulfillment of what was promised to the Jewish people, of what would happen of what was promised to Abraham long ago, and that is that fulfillment of what Jesus did on the cross, and his resurrection, and his ascension into heaven, and eventually his coming of the kingdom back here, heaven, where heaven and earth combine. And so just to keep that in mind as we move forward here. There's a few things I wanted to bring up related to, like I mentioned earlier, Marcion, who had a lot of bad theology. And he was kind of he was a very popular guy, apparently rather charismatic, and had a pretty good following. But midway through the 2nd century, Marcion, he was a devotee of Paul, apparently knew Paul's work very well, but seemed to have also misunderstood it. And he was considered to be a heretic. And so what he was teaching was not what Paul had taught, but kind of his own variation of what he thought Paul had taught. So around 144 AD, he claimed to have the true canon. Look at you. Good for you, Marcion. You have the true canon, inaugurated by Christ, and began to open his own churches with his own canon, or a new version of his canon, a new version of the canon, and his own theology. So he would claim that, and there are Christians today who would claim this, that Christ had come to start a new religion, that Paul never taught that. But that's what Marcion claimed, saying that the new religion had nothing to do with the past, that this was included. Let's see, what's the best way to say that? So anything that was in the Old Testament was no longer relevant or really relevant in the first place. So the God from the Old Testament was not the same as the God from the New Testament. There are people, like I said, who debate that today, saying there is no way that this Jesus and this God that we know of in the New Testament could be the God from the Old Testament. And the reason you say that is because you have not read the two and have not seen how the two work together and how well put together they are to where you can see it is the same God. And it's unfortunate that Marcion did not see that, and it's unfortunate that there unfortunately are still people who do not still see that today, but here or there. He also said that the Father, the God, the Father of the Christians was superior to the God of Israel. He claimed that Paul was the only apostle who faithfully taught the correct practices that were not contaminated with Jewish influence. So he was not a big fan of the Jews and probably had some sort of bone to pick. And I bet if we dig far enough back in Marcion's history, we'll see that he probably maybe had some bad encounters with the Jews. I know you're dying to know what the canon is that he created, because I mentioned it earlier. He had the gospel, which seemed to be Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So he had those. And he also had only 9 letters of Paul's and the letter to Philemon. And so you have, that's his version of what the Bible should be. He, for the most part, opposed anything coming out of the Roman church, which that'd be the church coming out of Jerusalem and in that region, soon to be known as the Catholic faith, not the Roman Catholic faith that we know of today in its modern version, but as in the Catholic faith, as in the universal faith, the universal God of everything. Not universalism. Two very different things, but Catholicism or Catholic mean universal. And so he was opposed to what had become this church by about 144 AD. This was a good thing. So the bishops of the Roman Church, these were not bishops as we know them from the Roman Catholic Church, but bishops of the early Christian church. They're like, well, let's kind of define this a little bit here. Let's kind of define our own canon, define our own history, and make sure that this guy Marcion is not causing too many problems here with our church. We're still, even though we're close to 100 years in, if not a little over 100 years in, there's still some questions that need to be answered and things that need to be firmed up. So they wanted to very specifically define what was they considered to be in the canon, and they also wanted to be able to say that and they also wanted to show that the Old Testament was still relevant and was not superseded by the gospel and the apostle. And so Acts was written, it says, or is allowed to be written, or is allowed to be part of the canon because it helped to win the argument of the Roman Church as it verified the Gospels. Like I said, it seems to be a bridge from the Gospels to the apostles, the letters, and it legitimized what the apostles wrote in the Gospels, which made, of course, Acts a keystone in the Christian canon. You really have to have Acts in order to very well understand what the rest of the Bible says, or especially what the Gospels are saying, and referencing to what Paul wrote, or what Paul's letters are in his epistles. So you have to have Acts. All right. As we continue on here, this is more about, let's kind of focus on the Jews that became followers of the Messiah, because there's a little bit of history we want to know with them as well. The Jews that determined the Messiah had come, and that they had entered the Messianic period, had to take a whole new look at the Old Testament. They're like, what did we miss in the past, or what are we trying to do here? And what they found, and what is fascinating about this, and I think the Gentiles took this, and of course because it's in their favor, is that they found that the Old Testament was a message for the entire world that the people of Israel did not embrace. So they finally realized, once Jesus came, the Messiah is here. We believe in this Messiah. Our faith is in this Messiah. It has fulfilled the Old Testament scriptures. But what we've also realized now is that he's here for the entire world. Jesus came for the entire world. Everything is pointing to that. It's not just the people of Israel. And then if you went back to, say, Genesis 12:3, there's that promise to Abraham related to that all the people of the world would find their blessing in him. Not some, not a few, not just a select few that we like, not some that we just believe in, but all people would find their blessing in God. And Abraham was told that as he was to go forward. The early Christian Jews saw the law and the commandments that we know of in the Old Testament differently. They see them not as a permanent structure that the Jewish people saw, but they see them more as temporary. They're the idea, and I think this is what we should teach when we teach the Old Testament in the church today, is that they're intended to point to the Messiah, which they did. And unfortunately, not everyone during that time saw this. And even today, a lot of people do not see how the Old Testament points forward to the Messiah. So I wanted to bring that up as well, because I think I find that to be fascinating, or just interesting. Fascinating is probably a strong word. I find it interesting how they had to go back and reevaluate based on what was going on and based on what Jesus did and the Messiah and everything related to that. They had to go and reevaluate tens of thousands, probably just 10,000 years, maybe not that long. Let's say centuries worth of knowledge that they had gathered, centuries worth of evidence, information, readings, scripture even, that they had. And they had to look at it from a different perspective to see and understand who this Messiah was and why the Messiah came, and ultimately how the Messiah had come for all of the world and not just for the Jewish people. So on to the next very exciting part, and I find this to be extremely exciting because I just like stuff like this, is the idea of when was it written? We really don't know. I mean, you could look at those of you who are going to the very front of the book of Acts in your New Living Translation and saying it absolutely says here it was written in 65 AD. You got about 10 different other commentaries and you'll kind of get a range. So it's okay, and that's okay. That's okay. It's ancient text, and that's fine. Most likely it was written, this is just my viewpoint based on the research I've done, but most likely it was done after Paul's death, which was probably, he died around 65, 66 AD, which is about 4 years before the Rome decided to destroy the temple one last time. Some would say that it was possibly written, so after 65, 66 AD, there's what was known as the Flavian Period, which lasted from 69 AD to 96 AD. Could have been during then. Some said it took it as long as not until the 180s, until it was fully compiled. And others would say it could have been maybe 110 to 120. Based on the author allegedly using Paul and Josephus' letters. So Josephus, as we know, was a Hellenistic historian during that time, very well known and very well read and very trusted historically by historians, both who are Christian theologians and those who are secular historians. So he shows that as well. So it probably could have been that time, the 110, like I said, 110 to 120, where it's just showing more of an institutionalized church. Acts was able to show that, which did not happen really until the 2nd century. But then you have Luke, and if Luke and Acts, and it's like I said, Luke, Acts, sometimes they say was together and maybe was written as one full book. Luke is dependent on Mark, because there's a lot of Markan influence in Luke, and we also know that for Matthew as well. So Matthew and Luke both have influences from Mark. John does not. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are referred to as synoptic gospels because they have synergy. John is kind of its own, which is fascinating, its own kind of more spiritual journey of a gospel, which is good. And anyways, so Mark was written around 70 AD, and so if there's influence from there, and then after 70 would make sense. So if it was after 70 AD, because it would make sense with what we read in Luke 19 and 21, which is a reference to the destruction of the Jerusalem temple as a past event, that has ushered in a time of the Gentiles. If we believe that Luke was a travel companion of Paul, some say the best time period would be between 80 and 90 AD. So, and that brings us to the next point. So after those fascinating dates, I know you've all jotted those down and are just fascinated by those. This brings us to the next point of who the author was. So the entire time I've been saying it was Luke, and most people would say it was probably Luke, but there's always debate about the authors because it doesn't actually say or state in the book that Luke wrote Acts. I mean, like from Paul's letters, we see that Paul wrote them because he actually says that. We don't see that from Luke. So we don't even know if Luke wrote the Gospel of Luke. There's debate about that. Again, not a problem with that, and that's with outside the context of this conversation. But anyways, here we go. So the early church tradition, so probably about 2nd century, said that the writer was a traveling companion and fellow worker of Paul's. Very well could have been Luke. Also, this person was with Paul when Paul was in prison in Rome and Ephesus. Luke was. Luke is mentioned in Colossians 4:14, which helps lead us to the connection that Luke wrote Acts as well as, of course, Luke. The reader would also note that there are sections in the second half of Acts that are in first person. It's kind of fun how it changes throughout the book, but not written by Paul. And it sounds like it's a companion who's writing it, almost writing it like a travel diary. And it's someone who's obviously very familiar with Paul and his travels and had obviously accompanied Paul on many journeys. Others would say that you could look at the style and grammar of Luke and Acts and see a lot of similarities there, and so that kind of could put the two together. One of the early church fathers, Irenaeus, he attributes that Luke was the writer, and he said that Luke, as the author, was writing this as a form, especially the part we know as Acts, as an apologetic, and he's trying to legitimize that it was an apostle-level work, which was compared to the heterodox work of the Gnostics during that time, and we don't even have time to talk about the Gnostics and Marcion. So we've kind of already talked about that a little bit. Irenaeus would also claim, and some of the early church fathers, who not all of them agreed, but most of them, that the writings were more authentic and tied to apostolic traditions, which Luke would have been very good at. There are several weak arguments out there, and we'll cover some of those, but none of them can really come to the conclusion, or, in my opinion, you could, like I said, this is just the research that I've done, could find that Luke was not the author, but you can't move forward any sort of conversation about determining who an author of a book at this age and of this significance would be without seeing there's a bit of naysaying regarding who the author is. Like I said, there's no direct attribution to the authorship. No claim the author was an eyewitness to any of the accounts. So we're kind of assuming that that's true. Saying it was Luke comes from what is read in 2 Timothy and Colossians. But both these letters have a little bit of negative marks towards their authenticity. And that, again, there's many things within that I'm saying today that are well without the scope of this, because you'd have to look into, see that, 2 Timothy was thought to not be authentic? Well, there are some people who would say that, and same with Colossians. And that's, again, another conversation to be had. And then the other things that we see here, there's some differences seen in Paul's sermons and in Paul's letters compared to how he is depicted in Acts. So, take those as you will. Like I say, those are minor points and not strong enough to say, oh, well, actually, now that I'm thinking about this, it obviously was not Luke. It had to be some other guy. No, I think it really was Luke, and I encourage you to continue to look that up. So using that string or that thread, we're gonna say it was Luke, and we're gonna say from that why it makes sense is that Luke was a well-known evangelist of his time, but he is also known to be a church historian. A lot of people refer to him as a doctor, but not a doctor like we think of doctors nowadays. A little bit different and wonky. That's a whole other, again, a different conversation. Luke could have also been a Gentile convert, which would have made sense of him traveling along with Paul. And the reason that they say that is based on how good he was at writing in Greek. He was a very good writer. He used a sophisticated level of the Greek language when he wrote. Some would say that he was such a well-written Greek writer that he was an artist. And then you have the reference to Theophilus, which I mentioned earlier, which you see both in Acts and Luke's, who most likely was a high-level Roman official, which also helps us to believe that, again, all this kind of helps us shows that Luke was probably Gentile who converted to becoming a follower of Jesus. What was also interesting with Luke is that he was able to come from a Jewish perspective or a Jewish traditional historical writing perspective, while also writing to a Greco-Roman audience, which is fascinating to be able to do that. His style, of course, shows that he is well educated, well written, but at the same time, he presents his text in a way that is more of a technical treatise, probably a better way to say it, and less than a typical historical writing, which at that time could be very much expected. It seems that his audience, based on his level of writing, was probably those others, much like a Theophilus, who were well educated. But also, it's also accessible enough to where those who are not as well educated could be able to access this, what Luke was trying to write. There are times where Luke will seem a little bit of anti-Jewish in some of his writings, especially in Luke. However, he is not in principle. To him and to other believers of that time, the Christian idea is a continuation of what he already believed. It is the fulfillment of Israel's religion. So, even though there are people, and I've read that about some of our other gospel writers, that people would say, well, they were obviously anti-Jewish. And, well, I don't think they were anti-Jewish, but I think at some point along the way, they're kind of ticked off with the Jewish people because of how mean and oppressive they had been to this new early church and how they had treated them. You have to remember that when Matthew was written, the early Christian church had already been beat up pretty well by the Jewish people at that time, the true Jews. So there probably was a little bit of animosity. I wouldn't say it was anti-type animosity, but there's probably not a lot of good blood between those groups at that time. So we've talked about the author, we've talked about when it was possibly written, and now what is the obvious next step? Well, we all know that the obvious next step is the style and the type of book that this is. It's written in a narrative form, much of it in first person, like a diary or travel journal, and is written, you have to think, like I said, he was probably writing this as an apologetic. So it's not only written to inform, but to persuade those who read it. So he was probably one of the first apologetic people who wrote apologetics or talked in apologetic way. It can be seen that Luke focused on cause and effect. He shows a linear history, which shows how and why Gentiles eventually became part of the community, which is really a strong argument for what is written here and why it was such a good, like I said earlier on, a cornerstone for the early Christian canon. And what you'll notice is that there's no others who write chronological order when looking through the early books of the New Testament. So this is very interesting that he did it this way. Another interesting tidbit is that let me skip that. Let's jump down to a little bit further here about this, a little bit more of the type of book. Acts was written as Acts, which was a form of literature. Acts were a form of literature during that time. And the people who would read Acts would find benefit, and we'd probably classify it, if it was written today, if someone were to write something like this, it would refer to as probably a historical fiction. But there are actually probably several different types of genres, of types of styles within Acts. One is a praxis. Were written about those are written about the great deeds of historical figures, like when Arian wrote the book of Anabasis about the military campaigns of Alexander the Great. That's one example of what we see here within the books of Acts. Luke is so if we were to combine the books again and look at Luke and Acts, Luke was written more as a biography, like I said earlier. Acts is not. It does have some biographical components within it, but like Greco-Roman literature would during that time. But some see it also as an epic, almost like Homer's Odyssey, or some sort of, like I said, a pious historical fiction. And maybe if, without trying to make it too complicated, which I'm going to try to here in a second, is maybe it's just a history book, an account, and you just think of it simply as an account of the emergence of the Christian movement, also known as the Way. But like I said, to make it sound not too complicated, but maybe a little fancy, you can say Acts is a theography, pretty good, of the Old Testament with an apologetic historiography, similar to, like I said earlier, of what something Josephus would have written during that time period. What we see from that is he's defending the movement, its founder, and the key leaders against the prejudice from both Jewish leaders and pagans, again, showing that it is a very strong apologetic. There are several categories of Luke's and Acts. There's the didactic side of it, there's the polemical side of it, and the evangelistic side of it. But it's mainly an apologetic, with Acts presenting Paul as, this is what I like, divinely chosen agent, a faithful herald of Christ, warmly conceived by Jewish Christian leaders, slandered and menaced by Jews, and treated unfairly by Roman officials. I just just told you most of the book of Acts. There you go, right there. There's your 6-point bullets of what Acts is. But that's kind of what it is Luke being able to present Paul in that way, that early leader of the church. All right, as we continue on here. Just not sure if I want to read all this or go through all this. Let's continue. Let's do this. So we have a little bit more of a summary of what the book of Acts is. And this is kind of where Luke Acts kind of comes together a little bit here. The church is shown to be radical to many, but at the same time harmless. And it also shows people to be, or this idea of this new, the Way, or this new group to be heirs of Judaism's religious heritage, the new covenant people. The writer links between the Gospel of Luke and Acts and how he includes stories of Peter and Paul. We see that echo the actions and activities of Jesus, establishing a model of godly living. So we'll see that in Acts as well. Some have said that the prologue into Luke would be a prologue into one of combined books of Luke and Acts. And the author did not intentionally intend it to be two books, but like I said, eventually it was kind of brought together as two books and then brought apart to separate the Gospels from the Apostle. If you read the intro into both books, you would see that there's a reference to someone of Hellenistic origin, and that's what we said was Theophilus. And some people say Theophilus may have not have been a real person. It could have been a representation of people. Theophilus means friend of God or friends of God. That could have been who he was writing to, the friends of God, the followers of Christ. That's one viewpoint here. But it also kind of shows us here, if we were to say that if Theophilus was real, and we'll talk more about this when we start chapter 1 here, maybe he was possibly a messenger of the early church. Maybe he was a friend or acquaintance of Luke. Maybe he even was a disciple of Luke. But what we know here is that the way it's said and the way it's written is that it seemed that it was urgent for Luke to be able to communicate what was going on to this person Theophilus, and maybe he had some sort of influence that Theophilus had that Luke needed him to go out and tell the story. Much of what is in Luke and even Acts are not by his own eyewitness. We've talked about that earlier. At least that was an argument that some people made, that none of it was. But not everything that he writes about he actually saw. But it seems like, based on some of the research that I did, seeing that the research that he did was able to allow him to compile a lot of the book. And we also know that he pulled a lot of stuff from Mark as well. Luke is also really good, since we've determined that it is he who wrote, is very good at sharing the principle of expected Christian living and the providing of a good and a bad example. One thing you'll see in Acts is that he will provide something someone good someone did in the church, and then something bad to kind of counter the two, to kind of give you an example. So example one would be Barnabas, and sells his land and gives all of the proceeds from that land to the community. That's good. Then you have Ananias and Sapphira, who sell their land, but only give a partial amount and then lie about it, acting like they gave their whole amount. So you have the good and the bad. So Luke will do that throughout Acts. That's just one good example of that. One other thing that Luke continually does is he points to the growth of the church, and he talks about the progress of the Word of God, or the Word of the Lord, and it comes up actually 10 times in Acts and 4 times in Luke. So he's really focused on the growth of the church. Again, he's an evangelist. He's also an apologist, and that's what he does. And this helps the reader now, but also the reader back then, better understand the growth and the maturation of the church during that time. That the church is not stagnant. The church is growing. It's a living, breathing, growing thing. All right. I think that's where we're going to wrap up today with this. There's so much more. You could spend hours, as you can imagine. There's books upon commentaries upon articles about just the origins of Acts, who wrote it, and everything like that. But I think we've done enough for today on that, and we'll start next week or next time when I'm able to gather all the content together. We'll actually dig into the books of Acts. I'll be focused on or be using multiple commentaries, but if you're familiar with N.T. Wright's commentary on the Acts, Acts for Everyone, I believe is what it's called, we'll probably be focused on using that as kind of our guide to go through this study. Otherwise, if we were to do it how I typically would do it, verse by verse, this could last for years. And I don't know if I have the energy to do that. So anyways, I'm going to, just for your reference, N.T. Wright's Acts for Everyone will probably be something that I know I will use to help structure the conversation. So if you have access to that or want access to it, I would highly recommend grabbing a copy of that, because he does an excellent job of explaining Acts as well. So anyways, I hope this helped. I hope you guys get something out of this, and we will see you soon. Thank you.